In this lesson, I'm going to talk about the life of William Shakespeare. I'm going to move a little bit more quickly than I normally would in class because you can pause it to write things down. And the notes for this are on page 4 of your packet, and all the things you need to write down are indicated by a pencil mark. His baptism was on April 26, 1564, and traditionally you were baptized 3 days after you were born at the time. And so oftentimes his birthday is put down as April 23rd, but that might only be because that's the day that he died in 1616. The information we have about him is really sparse. That's the church that he would have been baptized in Stratford-upon-Avon. And he did have several siblings. However, as you can see in your notes there, many of them didn't live very long, which is a pretty nice snapshot of the time period and how difficult it was. Will led a pretty lengthy life for the time period, longer than the average. And anytime you have a Joan 1 and a Joan 2, you know you've had a lot of babies or young people who have died. He was born, as I mentioned before, in Stratford-upon-Avon, and that's a pretty big tourist destination because of that. And all that means is there are a lot of Stratfords in England, and this one was upon the Avon River. That's the house he was born in, obviously a tourist destination as well. Pretty typical Renaissance-style house at the time. And they were middle class, and he eventually moved to London to pursue his career in acting, writing plays, and so on. And that's what London would have looked like in around 1600. That's a sketch of it. He married Anne Hathaway in 1582. He was 18 years old, and she was a bit older, actually. They had 3 children together, Susanna in 1583, Hamnet and Judith. Doesn't seem like there's any connection to Hamlet or anything, in 1585. And all 3 were illiterate, which is a bit strange. And when we get to the end of the video, I'm going to show a YouTube video about how a lot of people don't think this was the guy who wrote all this. Because why would his children be illiterate? I mean, it's the best playwright, perhaps the best writer, certainly the most famous writer of all time, and his children didn't know how to read. Seems a bit strange. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But that's a sketch of his wife, Anne Hathaway, and of course the actress today. No connection to it other than the fact that she might have been named Anne for that purpose. He died back in Stratford-upon-Avon in 1616. He was 52, and he was buried there as well. And I'm sorry, he was buried in Stratford-upon-Avon, but he has a famous memorial in Poets' Corner of Westminster Abbey in London, which is one of the most famous sites if you go to London to visit. And here are the words that are at the bottom here. Good friend, for Jesus' sake, forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be ye man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones. It's nice sounding, but it just doesn't sound very Shakespearean. Another kind of evidence that maybe this wasn't the guy. It seems like he could come up with something a little more profound, but maybe he was just trying to be funny. On the right there is Poets' Corner, and you can see that he is right in the middle because he is the most important of the English poets, playwrights. Queen Elizabeth reigned for most of his life, and that's quite an outfit she has on there. And as I mentioned during the introduction to Shakespeare presentation, had quite a long reign, and she loved the arts. She loved the theater, and that's probably the only reason that the plays survived, or that they were even allowed to be performed at the time. Of course, King James followed her, and he also enjoyed the theater, and Shakespeare died during his reign. This was his grammar school. Basically a 6th grade education. That's all he had. Another piece of evidence that maybe this wasn't the guy. Either he was a genius and self-taught, or maybe somebody used that name because they couldn't use their own name. In London, he joined the Lord Chamberlain's Men, which was an acting troupe, and it was funded by that guy, Lord Chamberlain. And It basically just meant that he probably loved the theater, wanted something to be named after him, and used a lot of his old clothes to donate as costumes, and travel around and perform in different theaters. But he was initially an actor in Lord Chamberlain's Men. Then the best decision he made in terms of his investments was to invest in the Globe Theatre. And that shot there is a rebuilt Globe Theatre, which is in London. That if you went to London today, it would be something you could see and watch a play in. But that is rebuilt exactly the way that it was. We'll talk about this tomorrow or the next day, the Elizabethan Theatre and how it was set up, what it looked like, and so on. But regardless, he became a part owner of the Globe Theatre, which was a smart investment. I mentioned iambic pentameter before, the rhythm that he wrote in, and this was nothing special. Everybody wrote in this rhythm, and it actually is pretty close to the way that we speak in English, that you generally have syllables that are stressed, syllables that are unstressed, and it kind of goes back and forth between the two. But he would have been thinking this as he was writing every line pretty much of his plays. Some parts in his plays are prosaic. They're written in prose. They're just like paragraph form. You'll see in Romeo and Juliet, the Mercutio and a couple of other characters speak in prose. But this rhythmic pattern goes like this. A U is an unstressed syllable. That's how you mark it, label it. And then a slash for a stressed syllable. And so if we just take, again, a famous line from it, but soft, but light through yonder window breaks. And it would go on like that. It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. And it's this pattern, this flow that, again, most writers of the time used in their plays. However, iambic pentameter was something that Shakespeare wrote most of his things in. He also wrote 154 sonnets, and a sonnet is a poem that's 14 lines long and is usually about love. And the rhyme scheme of a Shakespearean sonnet, they're called Shakespearean sonnets because so many of the 154 survived. They're also Italian sonnets. They follow a different rhyme scheme, but it goes A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, G, G, ends with that rhymed couplet. And so his plays, he wrote 36 or 37 plays. One's unfinished. You'll see that in a couple of slides. And they're divided into three types, like all plays were at that time. First, tragedies, which have a tragic hero that's different than a typical hero. This tragic hero has a major flaw, even though he's a great person, and a lot of pride. And as a result, he won't change. He won't admit wrongs that he's done. And this leads to a catastrophe. That word catastrophe is also a Greek word, like tragedy, that tells the downfall of the character. And usually the downfall is terrible, and the end of the play, it is the stage is covered with dead bodies, like at the end of Romeo and Juliet. Lots of deaths in tragedies. Comedies are kind of like romantic comedies today. If you think of most romantic comedies that you might know, even the ones that are totally goofy, they follow the same structure. And by the end of the play, even though there are a lot of mix-ups about who's in love with whom and losing the people that they love or whatever, at the end, things come back together and it usually ends in a wedding. Histories are based on true events and are basically retelling the stories of political leaders and has a very pro-England stance to it. A few of these are really famous, but in general, these ones aren't as popular nowadays as the tragedies especially, but also the comedies. And so these are the plays. You can see the one that was unfinished, which is why the number isn't exact, but he wrote mostly comedies, actually. And you look at the tragedies, and a few of them aren't all that well known, but the big ones are Hamlet, King Lear, Macbeth, and Othello. Romeo and Juliet was actually relatively early in his career. It is not considered to be one of the great tragedies. So, Romeo and Juliet, 1591. I would imagine that we know the basics of the story, that Romeo and Juliet are in love, even though their families hate one another. And we're going to be reading it, but also looking at a lot of scenes from the movies. The one on the right there is the Zeffirelli version, because he was the director, and that one's very traditionally done, but the Romeo and Juliet and that are just perfect. And on the left is the one directed by Baz Luhrmann in the 1990s, and is very 90s. They still have all the same language and everything, but it is modernized, filmed in Mexico City, and instead of swords, they have guns, and they drive cars and everything, and we'll be watching a lot more of that one, actually. So, a few of his best known works we're going to fill in as we go. On the left there is Iago, and on the right is Othello. If you've ever seen the board game before, the board game has black and white pieces because Othello is a Moor, M-O-O-R, which means from North Africa near like Morocco. And he is living in Italy, but he's obviously an outsider, and he's a general. He's a great military general, but this guy Iago hates him for some reason. We don't really know why. We don't know if it's a racial thing. We don't know if he's jealous, or some people even say he's attracted to him and wants to destroy him. And he doesn't do it in a direct way. Instead, he knows that Othello's main tragic flaw, his flaw in his character, is that he's really jealous of his pretty wife, Desdemona, who's white. And so in Othello, at one point he says to him, "Oh, beware, my lord, of jealousy. It is the green-eyed monster which doth mock the meat it feeds on," meaning that it eats you alive, and then you look ridiculous afterwards because you're jealous. And Othello doesn't take this advice. Basically, he's giving him this advice not to be jealous, but really he knows that Othello will turn around in his head and it'll make him worse. And so eventually Othello is convinced that his wife is cheating on him because Iago kind of sets it up that way. And he thinks this guy, Michael Cassio, is sleeping with his wife, Desdemona. And so Othello makes the very poor decision to kill his wife, as well as Michael Cassio. And afterwards, of course, he finds out, oops, she was innocent all the time. She did nothing wrong. And so what does he do? He kills himself. And Iago is found out and taken away to be jailed and tortured. That's my favorite of the tragedies. Here, we have a young Laurence Olivier playing probably the most famous role in Shakespeare. And he says at one point here in the graveyard, speaks to a skull. He says, "To be or not to be? That is the question," which means, does he want to live or die? Because his father has been killed by his uncle to try to take the throne. And now he has to decide, what do I do? Do I kill my uncle? Do I want to live myself? How do I handle the situation? And it's a very psychological play about Hamlet being very indecisive about what to do. The next one is about Macbeth. And this is the Scottish play. And basically, at the beginning of the play, he's a general, and he encounters some witches who are telling him his future. And what they tell him is that you one day will be king. And he says, "Well, that's strange. I'm nowhere near being king. In fact, all kinds of people would have to die in order for me to be king." And so his wife, Lady Macbeth on the left there, really pushes him when she hears this to start offing anybody who is in line ahead of him to be king. And so he and she both murder several people, including children who are in line to get the throne before him. And there are a lot of famous lines from this. However, the witches, while they're standing around the cauldron, say, "Double, double toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble." Pretty famous little couplet there. And in the end, of course, because of his tragic flaw, which is that he thinks that he's unstoppable because the witches told him that he would be, this all leads to his downfall. And one of the things that the witches tell him proves to be inaccurate in the end. King Lear is about a king and his 3 daughters, and they all want his money, and he's about to die. And really good line from this one: "Come not between the dragon and his wrath." This one, a lot of students in ninth grade read, and it's called A Midsummer Night's Dream. This one's on the quiz as well. And basically, it's about these fairies that live in the woods, and these young couples all go out into the woods one night to after a party, and the fairies all play tricks on them. They make one fall in love with another. They turn one guy into the head of a horse, or of a donkey, actually, an ass, and play all kinds of tricks on them and mix everything up. But then at the end of the night, everything goes back to normal. But Puck, there in the middle, that's his name, he says at the very end of the play, "If we shadows have offended, think but this, and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here while these visions did appear," implying that they were in a dream, the audience, or that life is but a dream. Much Ado About Nothing. This one is a lot of banter between a couple that loves one another, but also kind of digs at one another throughout. And you can see some actors that are well known in this movie version of it. Kenneth Branagh there, you might recognize him from one of the Harry Potter movies. But regardless, at one point, his wife, is his actual wife in life as well, Beatrice, says, "For which of my bad parts didst thou first fall in love with me?" It's a bit of a joke about, what part of me that you didn't like made you fall in love with me. The Merchant of Venice. And you see Al Pacino there playing the main role of Shylock in that play. And this is 1596. A great line from this is, "But love is blind." And yes, that's where it comes from. Love is blind, meaning that people make all kinds of terrible decisions about love because it doesn't see the faults out there. And lovers cannot see the pretty follies that themselves commit. Another comedy. Taming of the Shrew, another comedy. And here it's a woman who's pretty difficult, and it's the word shrew is a pretty sexist word, basically describing a woman who wouldn't follow directions, can't be controlled or whatever, because that was important at the time. And Elizabeth Taylor there is playing the main role. And great line here: "Sit by my side and let the world slip. We shall ne'er be younger." The Tempest, 1610. This is toward the end of his life. And this one's about a shipwreck. A tempest is a storm, and it's actually a shipwreck in the New World, somewhere in Virginia, the Carolinas. And this wizard and his daughter end up on this island. And they encounter a native there, and it's pretty interesting. This one's more of a tragic comedy. It's lighthearted, but at the same time dark at times. And that is where the term Brave New World comes from, which is a book. It's used quite often. And the line is, "How beauteous mankind is, oh brave new world that has such people in it." Henry V is history, and there are three parts to it, actually. And any of you who know the HBO series called Band of Brothers, which was about World War II and was a really popular series, that's what it comes from. And Henry V there, again, played by Kenneth Branagh, at one point has to give a speech to his troops. And he says, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers, for he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother." Even though he's a general and he's talking to all of these soldiers who are basically probably peasants, and he's able to rile them up and win the battle. Richard III, another terrific history. And this one starts off, actually, "Now is the winter of our discontent." Now, the actor there is dressed in sort of like Nazi-like regalia, because the movie that was made, this particular movie about it, modernized it, which is pretty typical. It happens a lot with Shakespeare, that people kind of get tired of looking at the same old thing, and so they modernize it. And this one's really similar to Macbeth in that Richard III, who was a real king, kills people off to become king. At the end, though, everything falls apart for him, and he is about to be killed. And he says at the bottom there, a horse, my kingdom for a horse." Basically saying, I'd trade my kingdom, everything I have, just for a horse so I could escape. But he does not, and dies. And so I mentioned before about how a lot of people, and this isn't really like a full conspiracy theory because there's a lot of evidence. And since we're also talking about history from hundreds of years ago, it's really hard to know what's true and what happened because records were so bad. So there are a lot of people who think that Shakespeare didn't write it. All of these plays. Maybe he wrote some, maybe it was a group of people who wrote them. Some even think it was like the Queen of England who did it, but she wouldn't exactly had all kinds of free time. But the best theory probably is this guy, Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford. And he, being in that position, wouldn't be allowed or it wouldn't have been acceptable for him to write all these stories about kings and rising to power and things that could be viewed as against elements of England or elements of the monarchy. And so he would have had to use a pen name, a fake name. And a lot of people think that he wrote all this and used the name William Shakespeare. And so this woman's pretty entertaining. It's pretty funny. So I'm going to show this video here. And it's just a couple minutes long, 3 minutes long, about who wrote Shakespeare.
Who wrote Shakespeare? Who indeed? Not the man from Stratford, Will Shakespeare, the soul of the age. Ha! He could barely write his own name, and his children carried on that fine family tradition. It was Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, an acclaimed scholar and literary genius, heir to the oldest, wealthiest, most illustrious earldom in all of England, and Oxford had a somewhat tenuous claim to royal succession. Shakespeare was obsessed with loss of royal privilege. Royal access was not easily granted, certainly not to those from the densely illiterate dung heap that was then Stratford, really. Remember, Shakespeare's first folio was dedicated to two noblemen affiliated with or married to Oxford's daughters. And the first two poems ever published under the pen name Shakespeare were dedicated to Henry Wriothesley, the third Earl of Southampton. Why? And most of Shakespeare's sonnets were addressed to him. Later, when that fair youth was in the Tower charged with treason, the sonnets became a poignant plea to the son that de Vere had fathered with Elizabeth. What? Yes. The Catholics in her realm wanted to worship in the old way. So to appease them, she posed as the Virgin Queen. But Elizabeth at court? More like the strumpet royal. Of course Elizabeth had dalliances. No, really. Elizabeth was a virgin her entire life? I find that idea to be downright unpleasant. Besides, an alliance with the handsome young Oxford would have secured the Tudor line. Though in the end, still a virgin, she decided not to name their son her successor. During her reign, the Queen had paid Oxford to write plays as propaganda, another reason to hide behind a pen name. Yes, Edward de Vere's life was the stuff of which Greek tragedies were made. Knowing that Oxford's extraordinary life is mirrored in Shakespeare's works makes them a more powerfully human experience, worth exploring.
Sorry, that's my cat. So yeah, worth exploring. I don't think we can take this as being definitive, but there's a lot of evidence, so it doesn't really matter in the end. Somebody wrote all this stuff, and that's what's important. Thanks for listening, and all of this will be on the Shakespeare Quest, so make sure you watched it all and got all the notes down.